Here we go, intro sequence. Alright everybody, welcome back to the Leo Perez Show. We are delighted to have Dr. Martin Sweatman. He's one of our good friends from the show and a person we admire a lot, scientist at the University of Edinburgh and fellow of the Royal Society of Chemistry. He has spent a great deal of his life also studying the Younger Dryas Impact hypothesis and the consequences that came about from that hypothesis. Martin, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi Leo, yeah, pleasure to be back, thank you.
Well, it's very special always to have you around, and I thank you very much for your time. As I have said many times in this show, the Younger Dryas is as a geological period interests me a lot, and also the impact hypothesis that has been in debate lately interests me a lot. So I want you to just document the situation and have a conversation with you to put it out there, because I get very excited with things, and I'm not a scientist. And I think that it's good to have conversations with scientists that can help us to put it a bit more of a rational and calm impression about what we feel and like about the world and its history. So, imagine that I know nothing about this and I ask, what is the Younger Dryas? First, I heard that word around. What is that?
The Younger Dryas, well, that's a geological period, about 1,300 years long. And it happened at the end of the Ice Age, the last Ice Age, and it began about 10,800 BC. And it's characterized by low temperatures in the northern hemisphere. So there was this sudden drop in climate, cooling climate, very rapidly. Not everywhere in the northern hemisphere, the pattern was sort of a bit varied, but overall, there's this sort of 5 to 10 degree Celsius drop in temperatures across the northern hemisphere quite rapidly. That carries on for 1,300 years, and then the temperatures go back up again by a similar amount, and that's when we enter what's called the Holocene period. So basically, it's this geological period of cold climate, like a mini ice age at the end of the last ice age.
What was happening before the Younger Dryas?
Well, we were in the ice age for maybe about 100,000 years roughly. And then there's this, what's known as the last glacial maximum, about 17,000 BC, I think. So 19,000 years ago. And then there was this slow warming. And then there was quite a sudden warming, which was the beginning of what's known as the Bolling-Alarod period. That's a sudden warming, and that lasted a few thousand years. And then temperatures started to decline, and that's when this Younger Dryas period suddenly begins. So we'd begun to come out of the Ice Age. There was this warming period, quite dramatic warming, and then suddenly we went back into this sort of mini Ice Age for about 1,300 years. That's the Younger Dryas.
1,300 years.
Roughly, yeah.
Roughly.
Yeah.
And this was atypical in the pattern, the general pattern that the climate was experiencing from the deep past. It was a rupture of the trend, or?
Yeah, so there was this gradual warming climate, quite slow but quite steady, and then there was a sudden warming, that's the Bolling-Alarod, and then this sudden cooling, and that's the Younger Dryas, that lasted 1,300 years roughly, and then warming again suddenly, and then we're into what's known as the Holocene period, which is kind of the modern geological period.
Okay, and so the reasons why that trend was disrupted are on debate, or is there an understanding of why that trend was all of a sudden reverted into a certain direction?
Well, that's what this is all about. This hypothesis, this Younger Dryas Impact hypothesis. So before that, I suppose that the sort of more or less, it wasn't proven, but the sort of generally accepted view was probably that this was just a normal part of Earth's climate, that there must have been some mechanism internal to Earth that suddenly caused this cooling, 1,300 years, and then a warming. And, we've seen previous, far back in the Ice Age, over the last 100,000 years, there have been several episodes of rapid warming followed by rapid cooling. So you might get a warming for a few hundred years, maybe 1,000 years, and then suddenly it cools down again. So they have seen these kind of really rapid, really steep changes in climate over the last 100,000 years. But this one occurred as we were coming out of the Ice Age, and then we seemed to go back into it again, and it was particularly steep. Anyway, so it's generally thought that this is probably just part of Earth's natural climate system. But then along came this hypothesis that this particular climate episode, this Younger Dryas episode, was potentially or perhaps triggered by a comet impact. And so that's really what all the debate has been about. What's the evidence for this comet impact? What are the consequences of that? Because along with this change in climate, at around about that same time, although there's a lot of debate about exactly when, because of the dating methods that are used are not very precise. So at about the same time as this beginning of this Younger Dryas period, there seems to have been changes in human cultures, potentially human populations dropped as well. And in America, that's known as the end of the Clovis period. And in Europe or the Near East, that story is associated, in my view, with Bakutepi and a few other places. So there's this change in human cultures and populations, potentially. There's this potential change in or a series of extinction events. So that's what's known as the end Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions. So there seems to be a whole bunch of large animals, that's the megafauna, in the Americas and in Asia, Eurasia, that seem to have gone extinct more or less about that time. So we're talking about things like certain species of mammoth or mastodon, ground sloths, horses, saber-toothed tigers or cats, and these kind of things.
I've heard about the North American lion, actually. Is this a prior, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to quote you on any specific species, but yeah, there was a bunch of species that seemed to go extinct around about that time, but the dating is not very precise, so it's been quite hard to argue the case that it all happened at a particular instant. Nevertheless, there is this thing called there is this sort of stratigraphic feature, or what's called like a horizon in the soil in many places in America, in the Americas and in Europe, known as the black mat, the Younger Dryas black mat. So this is like a layer of discolored soil, and it occurs, it's really widespread, not everywhere, but it's really widespread. And what they find is that it seems that the Clovis population in America seem to have gone and seem to have disappeared right underneath this black mat. So the black mat kind of forms like a barrier, if you like, in time. And also they find that this black mat in some places, it kind of drapes over the bones of several animals, or the skeletons of animals. So it looks as though that this black mat is is right on top. It sort of perhaps caused the deaths of those animals, and therefore maybe the extinctions of entire species.
So there is a synchronicity between the findings, the paleontological findings, and also the signature that seems to be on the soil, that something occurred around that time.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of the debates. So I mean, you can kind of divide the debate into was there a comet impact? Mm-hmm. Did this great cosmic impact happen? Did it affect many continents? And then there's the consequences of the impact. So did it trigger the climate change? Did it lead to megafaunal extinctions? Did it lead to changes in human populations and cultures? So you can kind of divide it out. And so what I did recently was published a paper just on the impact evidence, in which I came down really strongly in favor of yes. I mean, it's pretty certain. It's almost certain, I would say, that there was this cosmic impact. I don't go into the details. I don't make any sort of strong arguments again about the other things, but lots of other people have. So there's been this great debate about megafaunal extinctions. Could that have been caused or triggered by the impact, or was that caused instead by the rapid changing climate. But if the impact caused the rapid changing climate, then maybe that was actually the trigger for the extinctions. So anyway, a lot of this debate is to do with this boundary layer, which is known as the Younger Dryas boundary, at the bottom of this black mat. And because a lot of the debate about the timings of the extinctions and the timings of the changes in human populations, a lot of that science hasn't been taking into account this boundary. So it's basically ignored the relative, not entirely ignored, but it hasn't made a great focus on comparing where in the soil the archaeological remains are found relative to this Younger Dryas boundary. So because of that, we're reliant instead on things like radiocarbon dating to try and date the archaeological remains. And that's much less precise in the sense that you can get a radiocarbon date which can have an error of many hundreds of years. And so then that might make it look as though these extinction events and changes in human populations were hundreds, if not thousands of years apart, because of the uncertainty in the radiocarbon dating. So there hasn't really been yet a definitive study that's compared all this archaeological data to this boundary layer, which we're now saying, or I'm saying in my review paper, that we should be treating this boundary layer as a specific, as a real horizon, a single day essentially in the age of the Earth.
A single
and comparing,
day?
Yeah, essentially a single day.
Wow.
A lot of the evidence that we found, or that has been found at this boundary layer, was probably laid down. Let's start again. So the event itself, this cosmic impact, probably occurred within the space of a day across several continents, and then it can take longer for all of the signals of that event, or what we call the geochemical signals, or the debris, essentially, the debris from this event, to settle down. So you'll have some of the debris will be in the form of sort of microscopic particles, and that will settle out of the atmosphere quite rapidly within days. Then you've got finer particles that might be lofted high up into the atmosphere, and that might take weeks, months, maybe even years.
Because they orbit and then they fall back?
Well, some of it into the atmosphere, and then you're right, some of the material might even go into orbit. And that would then affect how long it would take to settle down to Earth. And then once it's settled in place on the Earth, you've got other processes that happen, weathering processes. You can have rivers and landslides and all sorts of storms, because the weather, the climate is changing. That can disturb the soil, and it can make it look like things are happening at different times from today's perspective. So the signals, these geochemical signals that are found at this boundary layer, they as well can have dates that can differ by maybe 100 years, maybe a couple of 100 years on different continents. But because of these signals, because these geochemical signals, which we can talk about, are very specific, then we can kind of link all these different dates. We say, look, even though those radiocarbon dates are maybe 100 years apart, what's the chances of having all the same signals dispersed over several continents? These are not separate events. This is probably one single event. So we can take that as like a boundary in time, a single day.
When you said this word, those signals are so specific. The question would be, what do you mean by so specific, and how does it work?
Yeah, so the main evidence, and this is what I review in my paper, is in the form of platinum. So not solid platinum, in like platinum bars or stones, but tiny sort of. It's platinum that's mixed up in dust somewhere, and that's formed a layer in the soil. So you've got sort of platinum. It's like they call it an abundance. So if you measure the platinum in the soil, and you go up in tiny little slices in the soil, in various locations, you'll see that there's this platinum spike. So that means that there's some kind of platinum dust layer there. So you've got platinum, you've got things called nanodiamonds, which are, just as the name says, they are nanoscopic diamonds. So you've got this sort of carbon material, and inside that are these little tiny inclusions that look like various forms of diamond. And you have got what I mentioned already, these microscopic particles. And again, they have certain features that make you think, or that lead you to think that these are formed at a very high temperature. So they look like basically tiny little solidified drops of mist. But the mist is made out of stone and iron. So this is molten, well, it could be a mixture actually. So
debris?
it could be, yeah. So it's debris that's been melted either from Earth's surface or actually part of the comet itself. Mainly, it's the Earth's surface, because that's a much larger bulk than the actual pieces of comet. But so you've got this sort of rock and iron ore that was sort of thrown up and melted and maybe even vaporized and then reformed into little sort of fine mist droplets, which then solidify out. So you've got these microscopic particles. And when they rapidly quench, they'll have certain features that which because of the rapid cooling, their surfaces become sort of fractured in a way which is quite characteristic of rapid cooling. So there are these particles, microscopic particles, nanodiamonds and platinum, and other things as well, like what looks like melted rock, basically. It's basically in the form of glass. So you can put all this together. And now those signatures are quite characteristic of a cosmic impact, but some of them, well, the platinum, for instance, is also characteristic of a volcanic explosion. So you might say, well, maybe it's volcanism. It doesn't have to be a cosmic impact. But the other signatures, the nanodiamonds, aren't associated with volcanism. The iron-rich, because some of these microparticles are rich in iron, that's not associated with volcanism. And the signatures that are associated with volcanism are missing. So things like tephra, there's no tephra in these layers. So tephra is like, it's like the fine ash that comes out of a volcano. Also, volcanoes typically emit sulfates, so they're kind of sulfur-rich fumes, basically. And they don't find sulfur in these layers. So, it doesn't seem that it's created by volcanic action. So we're kind of left with cosmic impact. Now, so you could argue perhaps that, okay, there were lots of small impacts, all unrelated, perhaps over a few hundred years on different continents. And these small impacts, and it's just coincidence that they happened in that small period. And it's just coincidence that the megafauna and the changes in human population and the climate change all happened at the same time. But there's a better explanation, which is that this was a massive cosmic event. That's much more likely than having lots of small unrelated impacts. The chances of this being caused by lots of small unrelated impacts is tiny compared to just one event that explains it all.
When I hear this competing theory, maybe a set of smaller impacts fell on the Earth. Smaller rocks fell on the Earth. I wonder, why is it so hard for some people to embrace the idea that a large impact occurred? Why is the need for a competing theory that would include these fragments?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's really one of the main hurdles that the idea had to overcome, which is that an impact of the scale that's being suggested was thought to be really unlikely by lots of scientists. So, it just seemed surprising. It doesn't mean to say it's impossible. So the scale of the impact that we're talking about would normally, or previous to this impact theory, would normally be thought to occur maybe once in a million years, something like that. So the fact that it only happened 13,000 years ago led many people, I think, scientists, to think, well, it can't be right, or it's unlikely to be true. It's not that it can't be true, it's just unlikely. But that, I think that view is probably wrong as well, because it doesn't take into account advances in astronomy, particularly cometary science that have been made. So that's another part, really, of this impact hypothesis, is that it makes a lot more sense if you also agree or accept that comet impacts on Earth are much more likely than they were thought to be. And there's this idea called coherent catastrophism, which is sort of invented by some British astronomers, Victor Clube and Bill Napier, a long time ago, actually, back in the early 80s. And they've published many papers on it. So there's this theory called coherent catastrophism, which is that you can get occasionally, you'll just occasionally get a giant comet from the outer reaches of the solar system, and it'll come in, and just by chance it will become captured into the inner solar system. And because now it's much closer to the sun, it will start fragmenting and decaying and breaking up. Now, we know this happens anyway. But the particular feature of this idea is that this is a giant comet, one that we haven't, of the kind that we haven't seen for a long time. So,
pardon, the comet that theoretically impact the Earth. You mean it would be a giant?
No,
comet? No. Sorry.
No. So what I'm talking about now is, so this theory of coherent catastrophism says that there is the potential, occasionally, probably once every 100,000 years, something like that, according to current observations, there's potential for a giant comet to enter the inner solar system and break up. And then it's one of those fragments that's suggested to have then sort of, well, you don't just get a single fragment when a comet breaks up. When a comet breaks up, it'll sort of shatter and splinter into lots of debris. And so it's one of those sort of debris clouds or swarms that the Earth encountered. One of many. There would have been many of these fragmentation events as this giant comet was decaying, and most of them would have avoided Earth completely. And they would have just sort of gradually kept on decaying into finer and finer particles. And that's what makes meteor streams. And in fact, there's a meteor stream out there at the moment in space that we know of, we know a lot about it, called the Taurid meteor stream. It's the largest meteor stream in near-Earth orbit. It's not currently the most impressive, because of the way that comet orbits change. We don't currently go through a dense part of this meteor stream, and it's very broad because it's so old. It's decayed and it's diffused, and so it's actually, we're going at the moment, the Earth orbits through quite a diffuse part of this Taurid meteor stream. But back in the day, when this giant comet was breaking up, this Taurid meteor stream would have been incredibly intense at different times. That would have the intensity of the meteor stream that we see on Earth would have waxed and waned over hundreds or thousands of years. And so there would have been a period when the risk to Earth of going through this Taurid meteor stream would have been much greater than at other times. And so it's thought that potentially that is when that this event happened, that we were traveling through a dangerous period and we just happened to be struck by one of these swarms of comet debris.
I still struggle to get a handle on the following. Why is it still hard for some people to imagine that such a punctual event could have happened? I'm feeling something connected to catastrophism and gradualism.
I didn't express that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you're right. Well, so there. Yeah. If you go back further, okay, you're right. So if you go back further, there is this whole concept of gradualism, which is a couple of hundred years old. It was invented by, the sort of the early fathers of geology, if you like. They invented this notion of gradualism, that basically all that happens on Earth are the things that we can currently see happening on Earth, things like erosion and weathering and so on, slow processes, perhaps with the odd large volcano thrown in because we can observe volcanoes. But a few hundred years ago, it was basically accepted that cosmic impacts, they just didn't happen. We didn't know about the asteroids. They knew about comets at that time, but there were so few comets that we could see that it was thought that they weren't important, that they would never cause a problem. Even though comets have this, in sort of mythology and ancient tradition, comets are viewed with suspicion and danger. It was thought by science, a few hundred years ago, that comets weren't worth talking about, and the asteroids weren't known. And then there's also Darwin's theory of evolution, again, which was thought, or that proposes that changes happen slowly. And so combined with the geology and the biological evolution, it's thought, we don't need to worry about catastrophic events on this scale. And that view kind of held really largely until probably about 1990. perhaps that kind of time. And then we have, we learned about the dinosaur impact, the Chicxulub crater, which potentially killed off the dinosaurs.
May I ask a question here? Was that revelation shocking to the status quo of science of the time, or was it not such like a shocker to understand that impact had happened?
Yeah, that's my understanding. It was kind of a bit before my time, and in a way, I was still going through graduate school. But so my understanding is that was a real sort of revelation, and that, in fact, this the Chicxulub impact that was thought to have exterminated the dinosaurs, that was fiercely resisted as well because of this long history of gradualism. So even though, so you've got this dinosaur killing impact, potential dinosaur killing impact, and then scientists realize, well, okay, maybe these threats are real from asteroids and comets. And by now, we'd been able to detect some more asteroids. So we could see that there were more things out there which could be a danger to us. We're starting to detect them with telescopes and so on. And so then there was this kind of reversal, which was that, okay, there can be impacts on Earth, but they're very rare. We don't really need to worry about them on a human timescale. And Kluber-Napier's theory of coherent catastrophism was first formulated about that time as well, which was saying, look, it's not just the asteroids, it's the comets as well. But it never really got accepted, and I don't understand why particularly, because when I've read the papers, it's quite a convincing argument to me. But nevertheless, that idea that comet impacts can happen on Earth and that they may even be more of a threat, more regular than the asteroid impacts, I just don't think it was accepted at all. It was, I think, you even had, I think, some astronomers saying that this is just nonsense. It's crazy talk. Words worse than that in scientific talk. And then, there's a few more. As time goes on, we see more and more things in space, more and more asteroids. We see more and more comets. Particularly, we find comets or things which have the potential to be comets when they start emitting dust, and we can see them. But there are these objects in deeper space, farther out in the solar system, that we can now detect because our telescopes are much better. And we realize that actually there are thousands, and probably there are millions of these things. So now, based on statistical estimates of how many, there's a really very good case for saying that actually there's a bigger threat than the asteroids, and that's the comets. And that's exactly, but that's not accepted, I would say. That's still debated and probably not accepted by the majority of the scientists. And now you have this Younger Dryas impact, which is saying, well, look, it only really makes sense. We think it's a comet impact because this impact seems to be distributed across many continents. Therefore, it's like a swarm of debris rather than a single asteroid.
Right.
Therefore, if it's a comet impact, then it ties in with this theory of coherent catastrophism, which wasn't accepted. So the Younger Dryas impact has had lots of barriers to overcome. Geologists, astronomers, archaeologists, none of them were looking at this. They all had their own pet ideas for why this Younger Dryas period happened, extinction of the megafauna and so on. There's some very popular ideas in different fields. And then you've got this new theory that comes along saying, no, it's another cosmic impact, just like the dinosaur killing one. And I just think people just couldn't believe it. I think that's crazy talk. But the evidence, I think, now is stacked up to the level where it has to be accepted, or at least strongly considered. And I think it has to be strongly considered for all these other things, the megafaunal extinctions, climate change, and so on.
The event of the dinosaurs, you mentioned this layer that we can find that dates around the Younger Dryas period. Has there similar scientific work done around the comet of the dinosaurs, of matching this impact with a certain layer and the cosmic signatures that it left behind?
Yes. Yeah. In fact, they are very similar. So in the case of the dinosaurs, well, in the Younger Dryas impact case, the sort of rare metal that we found is platinum.
Okay.
But for the dinosaurs, it was iridium, and that was one of the key pieces of evidence that helped to make it a convincing case. So there was this layer of iridium found in the soils, all roughly of the same date. I say soil, we're now talking 65, 66 million years ago, so we're talking about rocks. Yeah, and so the same kind of things as well, nanodiamonds and microparticles and so on.
All right, so well, that means that two similar works have been done and the signatures are similar, so it seems like the case for the Younger Dryas impact is overwhelming, apparently. Is that a good word to use, or?
Yeah, I mean, the history of these two debates is so similar. They both start off being sort of doubted highly. The evidence stacks up, the same kind of evidence is found. And then gradually they start to become accepted. And now I would say that, everyone's heard of the Chicxulub impact that killed off the dinosaurs, and it's kind of, it's more or less accepted. And I suspect that in 20 years' time, because it takes that long, that the Younger Dryas impact will be more or less accepted.
Interestingly enough, there is something that you managed to change in my perception of this debate in this conversation, and that is that I was feeling gradualists as, in a way, I'm going to say it from my own perspective, as kind of cowards a little bit. It's like, what are you afraid of? Come on, these events, big events happen. Let's face it. Don't hide your head on the sand. But yeah, now I see that, of course, we didn't have the capacity to see outwards in space so much. So it's kind of like you cannot blame them to not be used to the fact that we're surrounded by all these potential impactors, right?
The benefit of hindsight, yeah.
Yeah, because I was really, in a way, defiant to the position of the gradualist, in a way. But now, after this conversation, I sort of calmed down a bit and I understand, okay, I see why.
Things are changing quite rapidly in our ability to observe things in space, to pick up asteroids and comets. So if you go back 20, 30 years, the databases, the comet and asteroid databases were nothing like they are today. And so, yeah, it would have been harder back then to have made the argument. But today, I think we've got pretty good statistics, pretty good databases on these things. And, there are papers where people do, based on the current population of these comets in the outer solar system, they're called centaurs. Mm-hmm. It's just a name for what are basically going to be comets. And they're orbiting in this space between Jupiter and sort of Pluto. And so we can see hundreds of these things. And because of how they've been observed, there are predictions about how many there are, so based on statistical estimates. And the predictions are that there are probably at least 1 million, probably 10 million, and maybe 100 million of these things. Yeah. So if you use those statistical estimates now, along with orbital calculations, basically you just forward wind time, do these orbital calculations, and see how often one of these things comes in from the outer solar system and comes into the inner solar system. And you can see, actually, we expect this to happen. The Younger Dryas impact is entirely expected based on what we can currently see.
Has this information changed the way you interact with the world? I mean, like, maybe you're sometimes think about, oh, well, maybe actually there is a band from London called The Comet Is Coming, by the way.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant band. It's excellent. Kudos to them. I love them. So, I mean, has it changed your perspective of life, and how do you go about your daily day-to-day, or you leave it on the background?
Well, no, I mean, it certainly has made a big difference, yeah. So I spend quite a lot of my time thinking about these things and writing papers. I've written a few papers now on the subject. This review paper. Of course, it all started with my paper on Bakutepi, which then led to me writing a book and investigating this sort of zodiacal theory, which seems to be there at Bakutepi. That's how I interpret Bakutepi, using the zodiacal theory. So I've done a lot of investigating of symbols through time, basically in different parts, well, in mainly Europe and Eurasia. So yeah, and now there's all this sort of geochemical research There's all the astronomy. So yeah, I've read a lot of different research papers that I would never thought I would be reading maybe only 5 years ago. Things have changed quite a lot. And at the same time, I'm still trying to carry on with my sort of normal research life.
What caught your attention so intensely there? I mean, there are so many fields of study. Is it possible to answer that question?
Some people, I guess, are just more curious than others. So I've always been curious about the mysteries of the world. That's what gets you into physics quite a lot. If you're a theoretical physicist like me, you really want to understand the big mysteries like quantum mechanics and relativity and particle physics, along with all sorts of other things, strange things. So it's the strangeness of the world that actually helps you become a physicist, theoretical physicist particularly. And then, along with that is an interest in ancient archaeology, ancient cultures, but not an intense interest particularly until I became aware of Göbekli Tepe back in about 2008, probably. That's when I first heard of it, I think. And that really interested me. Like a lot of people who were aware of it, Göbekli Tepe was like amazing. It shouldn't be there. Really, really anomalous place with all these animal symbols. I had no idea what they were at that time, but I kept an interest in it. I kept on the lookout for anything interesting. And then I just happened to, I read one of Graham Hancock's books, Magicians of the Gods, which had this initial decoding, this sort of the key insight into what these animal symbols might mean. And so then everything followed from there. So it was a real sudden change that I wasn't expecting it to happen. I was just reading his book and then, oh, wow, really? And then I could develop it a lot further.
So we just talk about the impact and talk about the fact that it seems there's a solid case behind it. And then there is a word that comes to my mind right now, which is Abu Hurayra, right? There seems to be a very clear signature that perhaps humans observed this event and were affected by it directly. Can you tell us the story of Abu Hurayra and what's there that it relates to the theory, to the
so I mean, Abu Hurayra is a site in northern Syria. It's only about 100 miles south, roughly, of Göbekli Tepe. It's another one of these Younger Dryas boundary sites, but specifically, it's an ancient village. It's one of the world's first villages. So people were, it appears that at the time of the Younger Dryas Impact, not just Abu Hurayra, there are a few other villages as well that archaeologists have found. These are people known as the Nunatathian who lived in this region. So they just started building settlements. So they were actually staying in one place for the whole year. Abu Hurayra was one of them. And so this Younger Dryas boundary layer is there in the site of Abu Hurayra. So there's this layer of all of these things, nanodiamonds, platinum, microspherules, and Abu Hurayra particularly, they've got the molten glass as well. So they absolutely know that some kind of cosmic impact destroyed this little village of Abu Hurayra. And the dating of that is completely consistent with this Younger Dryas impact. So it's another one of these boundary sites. They don't know for how long, but people eventually came back to Abu Hurayra. It might have been 100 years later, maybe several hundred or 1,000 years later, but eventually people came back to Abu Hurayra and started living there again. So you've got these kind of two layers which are split by this boundary layer. But the whole site, I think, is now underwater because of the river side where it was located has now been immersed under the water. There's a dam basically on the Euphrates. I think it's the Euphrates, one of those rivers. And so the whole place is underwater. So all of the evidence from that site, they had to quickly recover before the dam was built. So there's like speed archaeology. They get all the stuff. And so the data that they're now currently looking at is sort of what's recovered and preserved in various labs and museums.
I see.
Yeah. Anyway, so this was about 100 miles south of Göbekli. And it's very clear it was destroyed by a cosmic impact. So the people at Göbekli probably would have seen that. And there's other evidence as well around the region of Göbekli Tepe that correlates with that. So there are lakes in Turkey. Lake Van is one of them. It's not the only one, where there is this layer of soot and charcoal, and it's quite a thick, intense layer. And again, the timing is perfectly consistent with the date of the Younger Dryas impact. Now, the papers where these carbon rich layers are found, they attribute these layers to, it's just a forest fire or something like that. But if it was a forest fire, then it happened at exactly the same time as Göbekli Tepe. It was exactly the same time as the Younger Dryas impact within dating accuracy, and it's the most intense burning episode over the entire history of Lake Van, up the record that they have, so 20,000 years. So, it's a singularly large and intense episode at exactly the right time. So it's not just Abu Hurayra. There's other evidence in the region of Göbekli Tepe that this cosmic impact event affected the Göbekli Tepe. The people there would have experienced this. And one of the other effects that it's thought that might have happened, so along with the debris that's produced, you get a lot of smoke and ash and soot from all the fires, because there are papers which suggest that about 10% of the world's surface was satellite. 10% of land surface.
What percent? Sorry.
10%.
Wow. In an instant. In an instant. We mean in a day.
In basically one day. Yeah. That's the suggestion. So again, I've looked at those papers. I've analyzed, reviewed them, and there's a lot of uncertainty, I think, in that estimate. So I don't think we can be very sure. It might have been a bit more. It might have been quite a lot less.
Can we be sure of saying a large landmass, a large piece of land?
A lot. There's a lot of they call it biomass. There was a lot of burning of biomass, and some of that would have been direct hits, perhaps, or directly satellite by the actual air bursts and the impacts. But probably most of that is sort of secondary effects. So, hot debris falling out elsewhere and causing fires elsewhere. So the people at Göbekli Tepe would have been very aware of this event, and all of that ash and the soot, it's according to these papers, would have created absolute darkness. That's the suggestion. For a period of 6 weeks or more. It's hard to imagine absolute darkness. So it'd be like living in a cave. So you would have to have a fire. You'd have to have some means of making fire to survive. Otherwise, you'd just be stumbling around. Same for the animals. Obviously, they don't make fire.
Wow. Okay. And then there is another word that comes about, which is Göbekli Tepe, right? So what is Göbekli Tepe, and what is interesting in that place, and why should we pay attention to it?
Well, it seems, according to the interpretation that I have, it seems that it's a memorial or a record of this event. So
of the Abu Hurayra event?
Of the whole, well, yes, but probably specifically Abu Hurayra, probably, but perhaps more generally of that day.
Sure.
Across the whole world. If all skies go black completely for weeks, then this is affecting lots of people. It's a massive event. It's never happened, or in your lifetime, it's never happened before. So anyway, so Göbekli Tepe is, when it was discovered, it was really an unusual place, an unusual discovery, because it was a site on top of a hill in Turkey. As I say, only about 100 miles north of this Abu Hurayra village in Syria, where archaeologists have found these great megalithic stone circles. There are several stone circles, giant pillars with carvings on them, intricate carvings of animals and other abstract symbols. And it dates to, about 1,000 years, maybe a little bit more, 1,000 years, that's the current dating, after the Younger Dryas impact event. That's the current dating, but that dating applies to the wall. There are some carbon particles in the mortar of one of the walls that archaeologists have dated. So that applies to the wall of one of these circular enclosures with the stone pillars. And then around that, it was thought for a long time there were lots of sort of smaller, what are thought to be temples. We're not entirely sure. I mean, they look like temples, but can we say definitively they're temples? Not quite. But there are these round circular enclosures which look like temples. And then around that, there were lots of smaller buildings which were also thought to be temples by archaeologists. But now, in the most recent report, it looks like Bakutepi was an actual settlement on top of the hill, not just a system of temples. Anyway, so the really interesting thing from our perspective is that, was it back in 2017, I wrote a paper which decoded the symbols on these pillars. And there's one particular pillar which can be interpreted as a date, written using the astronomical symbols, a date. And that date is, within the uncertainty of this interpretation, is the same as the Younger Dryas event. And other pillars can be interpreted as indicating the Taurid meteor stream. So these are all, in my interpretation, these are all astronomical symbols relating to this event. Things we don't really know how old Göbekli Tepe is, even though the earliest date we currently have is for one of these circular enclosures. Archaeologists have only just realized that this is a settlement, and they haven't got down very deep, because what happens is this, at that time, people of that time, they built layers of houses on top of each other, layer after layer after layer. They might create, they might build a new layer of housing every 100 years or so. Because there are all these layers, and they haven't actually got down to the bottom of Göbekli Tepe yet. So they don't really know how old it is. Probably, in my view, it's going to go at least as far back, I would suggest. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes back to the Younger Dryas event, because that's, in my view, that's probably when the site was, when the site began. And possibly it was a whole bunch of
Can you repeat the date? Sorry, can you repeat the date when you think the settlement began?
Probably the Younger Dryas Impact, or round about then.
So
that's speculation, but simply because of my interpretation of the symbols, it would make sense if Göbekli Tepe was essentially a bunch of refugees from lots of neighboring places that kind of got together and decided to build this system of temples and then started living there.
Can you tell us? Okay, the catastrophe happens. There is this very, very massive day. Can you narrate sort of what would happen to humans if that were to occur? I mean, people of that time, do you think that this generated the situation in which there was a population collapse and then there was the necessity of migration? In other words, how global was the whole event, and how possible it is that civilization was heading somewhere and then there was an event that sort of resetted a process that was going on, if one could argue it like that?
Yeah, so the evidence we have now for the event is across North and South America. We don't know whether it sort of covered the entire continents, but there are lots of sites in lots of different places in North and a few now in South America, right down to the tip almost of South America, where this geochemical evidence is found. South America also underwent a sort of mysterious episode of megafaunal extinctions at about the same time. So you've got North and South America, which are potentially involved. You've got Europe and what we call the Near East or Southwest Asia, the western part of Eurasia, the larger continent of Eurasia. That's where these geochemical signals have been found, and that's where the sort of, when people talk about megafaunal extinctions and cultural changes and population changes, that's what they're really talking about. So that's about half of the world's landmass.
It would have been affected in a day.
Yeah, but the darkness, if this soot and ash, if it's correct that this was in the atmosphere for 6 weeks or more, well, that means it's a global event. Nobody on Earth, everyone on Earth would have experienced this darkness to some degree, because the atmosphere circulation. Within a period of 6 weeks, would have transported things around the whole world. So no, everyone would have seen something. But the people and animals in the Americas and Western Europe, it seems, would have experienced the worst effects. It's hard to say exactly, we don't live then, so we have not lived to. It's hard to say exactly what it would have been like, but so lots of people presumably would have been killed, and animals outright on the day of the impact. Following that, you've got darkness, presumably, lots of fires. So lots of the biomass, lots of the vegetation is burned up. So food is going to be pretty scarce. And if you've got complete darkness, how do you find it anyway? So the humans would have presumably been, if there was this darkness, which it seems that there was, would have needed fire, would have been congregating around points where there was torchlight or firelight. So that would immediately, you'd have thought the survivors anyway, would have been drawn to these communities where they could keep the fire going so they could actually see. And that might have been, how things started off, bringing people together. Now, before the impact happened, pretty much everywhere on Earth, as far as we know, this is the sort of the standard archaeological view, pretty much everywhere on Earth, people were hunter-gatherers. Even in the region of Bakutepi, people were thought at that time to be hunter-gatherers. Now, a little bit different. Some of the communities or some of the cultures, particularly in the region of what's known as the Fertile Crescent, so particularly these Natufian people, as far as I understand, they were the first people, as far as we currently know, that started to settle down and build settlements. They were still hunter-gatherers, so they still, went out to hunt for their food, and pick their food from trees from far away and bring it home and so on. They might have started to do a little bit of experimentation with keeping animals, or with bringing plants closer to home, planting them at home and tending to them there. But anyway, they were, as far as we know, the first people to actually settle year-round in the same place, because until those people, pretty much everywhere else, as far as we know, hunter-gatherers would be moving from site to site through the seasons, maybe staying quite a long time at one site, until the local resources were exhausted, and then they'd move on to another site and camp there for a few weeks or months, or just keep moving around, hunter-gatherer. So these particular people in this region of Fertile Crescent and Natufian, they were a little bit special. They'd started to settle down and build sedentary communities, and then this event happened. And then we find there is this, what appear to be temples, which we've never seen before in the archaeological record, or since for several thousand years. It seems to be a really unique place, Göbekli Tepe. There was this temple, or what appear to be anyway, a series of temples on top of the hill with all of this, what appears to be astronomical symbols. So however you look at it, I think, Göbekli Tepe does appear to have played quite a special role in the change in culture, or the development of civilization. Some archaeologists kind of refer to it as changing everything. For a long time, archaeologists were looking for the origin of civilization in this region, and that was taking them further and further back. And they were basing their search on what's the earliest evidence for agriculture that we can find, because agriculture was associated with the origin of civilization, or the earliest civilizations. It was thought that you needed agriculture to build large communities that could support themselves, and that's kind of linked with the origin of civilization. But then you find Göbekli Tepe completely different. It's got these temples which no one was expecting, with all these symbols on which no one was expecting, and it seems to be right at the start of this period when there was this change in culture, and when
and then those geological events happening, apparently there's signature of them, right? I mean, it coincides.
Sorry?
It coincides, some sort of geological / cosmic signature / very odd temple appearing apparently out of nowhere.
That's right. And, who would have needed to build this temple, this anomalous temple, which we never saw before and we don't see again afterwards? Why was that built? The archaeologists who are excavating it don't really, as far as I think. I don't think they really have a good explanation for this anomalous feature.
Is there
But it makes
anything?
sense.
Is there
It makes
anything
perfect
similar
sense.
to Global further in the past, or?
There are other settlements. So around in that region, dated to about the same time, there are other very early settlements. But in terms of the symbolism, these sort of T-shaped pillars, particularly in terms of having temples, let's say, we don't currently know of any other site. There is another site about 40, 50 miles from Göbekli Tepe called Karahan Tepe. And that's only just recently been discovered. They're starting to excavate it. And that looks like it's got a lot of the same symbols, or similar symbolism to Göbekli Tepe. I don't know whether they found any temples there yet. It looks to be a series of sort of dwellings or houses.
I see.
But again, they've got T-shaped pillars. So it's kind of related to what's going on at Göbekli Tepe. But so far, nothing quite on the scale of, in terms of the sort of the architecture of Göbekli Tepe, this very grand statement, which would have required a lot of coordination and planning among the people.
So far, we have done 2 shows together, and the first one was related to your book Prehistory Decoded. And I would hope that you would give me the opportunity to do a third episode eventually together to go in deeper, so we can go deeper into this theory, because it's very fascinating. I'm going to underline quickly what I understand from this theory. As you are a person who analyzes the motion of particles, am I correct? Is that your main job inside a chemical compound, right?
Yeah.
And so you're a person who is used to handling immense data sets. That's what I imagine, right?
Well, it's more about theories. I'm a sort of theoretical physicist or a physical chemist. So yeah.
Running simulations and variables in your head of very large complexity. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I do that as well. So things that are called molecular simulations.
So I imagine that you were able to extrapolate your toolkit outwards to observe this event and observe the imagery that you have noticed of the event. Better said, to be more precise, not the event of Göbekli Tepe, to observe the imagery that you observed in Göbekli Tepe and extrapolate your capacity of build complex models to connect a couple of dots together and reach to certain conclusions about what Göbekli Tepe may mean. Is this a good characterization of your theory?
Yeah, so pretty much. My expertise is kind of at the boundary of chemical physics and physical chemistry, chemical engineering, and material science. So I have some familiarity with the terms in the geochemical papers. Some kind of familiarity with the experimental methods and the material science side of it. But when it comes to Göbekli Tepe, what you really need, if you're going to interpret these symbols, is a statistical method. Code breaking, it's based on statistics. You need a statistical method for analyzing the positions, orientations, similarity of shapes in space. And so, you need an understanding of how to think about the statistical distribution of objects, which is exactly what we do in statistical mechanics. That's my area. We're looking at the statistics of particles, chemical particles in that specific case, but you can apply exactly the same ideas. It's not complicated statistics, it's just very basic statistical analysis to the positions and orientations of shapes on a pillar. It's the same mathematics.
Exactly. So I hope we can explain.
And I've often thought, you kind of hear sometimes, oh, I'm not an archaeologist, so what do I know about it? Yeah, well, I would say, well, the archaeologists aren't statisticians, particularly aren't statisticians when it comes to analyzing the statistics of shape. So what do they know about it?
Exactly.
They're not the right people to be interpreting this particular pillar with all these shapes on it.
Yeah, and that's precisely what I would like to make a full episode on that theory. I think that 3 episodes together exploring this idea is a pretty healthy debate. As a last question of this day, I want to clarify the following. What got me... Actually, the question comes twofold a little bit. What got me interested into this topic was a set of Joe Rogan episodes that included the guests Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock occasionally. And I'm not going to claim that this is what Randall Carlson said. I'm going to share with you my impressions of what I took from that talk. And the impressions that I took from that talk is that the Laurentide ice sheet melted catastrophically and in a very rapid fashion. Once more, I respect Randall Carlson a lot, so I may be misinterpreting his words. This is my interpretation as an amateur or an observer. But what I understood from him, and that's what really shocked me when I saw this geological evidence and I started imagining what a flood of that dimension would mean, and also when I started imagining the correlation that seemed to be between myths of great floods and then, oh, a great flood that may have happened. When you're thinking about the melting down of the Laurentide ice sheet, what do you think? What should we know about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I like Randall. He's a very smart and charismatic guy. I don't know whether, to be honest, I haven't heard him talk about the melting of the Laurentide ice sheet, so I'm not entirely sure what he says about that.
It's brilliant. It's a brilliant. Whether it's true or not, it's an excellent watch. I promise you. Yeah.
But as far as I understand it, there are two major melting episodes that sort of bracket the Younger Dryas period. So there's one, which, if you remember back to the start of our talk, I mentioned the Bolling-Alarod period. It was a rapid period, very rapid period of warming before the Younger Dryas, hundreds or thousands of years before the Younger Dryas. Well, we can see from evidence, from oceanic evidence, we can see that there was this period of relatively rapid melting of ice caps and glaciers and so on. So there's this kind of, not jump, but there's this relatively rapid rise in sea level corresponding to the warming period, the Bolling-Alarod warming period. And then we've got another relatively rapid rise in sea level at the end of the Younger Dryas corresponding to that very rapid warming period. But we don't have a particularly strong signal in terms of sea level change at the Younger Dryas impact. There are some papers which say, yeah, we can just about make out a signal. So it's small and the error bars are quite large. So the uncertainty is quite large in how big an effect this was. But there are some papers that claim that, well, maybe sea level rose around 3 or 4 meters at the time of the Younger Dryas impact. Now that's not nearly as large as these other melting episodes when sea level changed by, I don't know, something in the region of 15 to 20 meters. Anyway, so there is some evidence for rapid melting of ice caps and ice sheets and glaciers and so on at the time of the impact. Now that might correspond, perhaps a little bit of that could have been direct melting of ice from any comet impacts. But probably that contribution is relatively small, simply because there's just not enough energy to melt huge amounts of ice, even in a comet impact, as destructive as it is. I mean, the event we're talking about is pretty big, but it's still nothing as big as the dinosaur impact. That was on a much, much bigger scale. Or the Chicxulub impact. Anyway, so probably if there was a sort of a few meters perhaps of sea level rise at the time of the Younger Dryas impact, probably that was caused by the breaking of ice dams and the release of basically these glacial lakes, massive glacial lakes that are sort of in the region of the ice caps or the ice sheets. And they would have been, it's thought that they were dammed up from time to time, and then you get the dam breaks and you get these, masses of cold water that pours out, goes down the rivers and into the oceans. And that was until the impact theory, it was thought that this release of cold water from the glacial lakes into the oceans, that was the only driver for the climate cooling. According to our understanding of climate, the way the climate works, if you put lots of cold water into the northern oceans, then it stops, it sort of prevents lots of the ocean circulations happening, and that will then cool the northern hemisphere. Anyway, so that was the idea. So, I don't see, I don't understand if Randall Carlson has an issue with ice sheet melting at that time. I'm not sure that there is an issue really. I think it's
No, most likely was my perception of it that you leave those talks with the perception that the Laurentide ice sheet. Let's just in case for if there is somebody who does not know what this is, there was a ice sheet in North America, and this is actually quite well documented. One leave that those talks of Joe Rogan with that sensation that this melted in a matter of weeks, something like that. Which I guess I'm going to take that idea and put it on my drawer of interesting,
Mm.
fantastic ideas that perhaps are not true. I again don't claim that that's what Randall Carlson said. That's sort of the impression. I'm a quite impressionable person. I'm very open, and so perhaps
I
this.
mean, I know that Randall has talks frequently about mega floods,
Yes,
and I think that's to do with this the breaking of the ice dams. And
he's
but I think
against
again
the.
the
See,
scale
he's
that he's
against
talking
the
about.
Missoula floods slash
Yeah,
slash
yeah.
gradualist vision of those lakes breaking apart just from the breaking of ice dams. He suggests an external factor. Of that I'm sure.
Yeah, yes, and I think that's probably correct. It's just that that doesn't mean that there has to be lots of massive amounts of ice melting. It's the water's already there
Yeah.
in the lakes. It's just that the lakes burst and the water floods out.
And
I think a big difference that Randall has between like the conventional story of those floods is I think that he talks about them being one massive flood and maybe not much more than that, whereas the conventional view is that there are lots of these floods, different times. They all, the dam breaks, the flood happens, it reseals, the lake reforms, it breaks again, and so you get these layers upon layers of flood waters or silts. And I think Randall's view is that probably there was just one, or there was one major event which was bigger than all the rest. I'm not sure about that.
And to close this conversation that has gone wonderfully about the Younger Dryas in general, what about the crater? What do we know about the crater? Is there something there that perhaps?
Yeah, I can't believe we haven't mentioned the crater already.
Well, the best for last.
So there was this crater discovered in Greenland just a few years ago. And a long time, well, it was often said that a crater isn't necessarily needed for this Younger Dryas impact theory. Even without a crater, we have enough evidence to suggest that it happened. But anyway, there was a crater found in Greenland. It made big news. The Hiawatha crater underneath this Hiawatha ice sheet on Greenland. It's about 30 kilometers across, and it's pretty much, I would say, confirmed to be a big crater. What we don't really know is exactly how old that crater is, so we can't tie it exactly to the Younger Dryas impact. But we know in sort of geological timescales that it must be relatively young, or it's thought to be relatively young, because it's under this ice sheet. And if it had been there for hundreds of millions of years, then this ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet has been there for at least 3 million years. And probably because of the way that the ice sheet moves, it would have scoured the ground beneath it and erased this crater. So the fact that the crater is still there means that it's probably less than 3 million years old. And according to the evidence that they have, it could even be as young as the Younger Dryas impact. And so that's the sort of great excitement, is that maybe this is the really big Younger Dryas impact crater. Maybe this was the biggest fragment that hit us on that day. It slammed into Greenland. Which it's kind of in the right place, more or less the right place to fit with the theory as well. So it's not quite a smoking gun because we don't know the age of it. Interestingly enough, there is another feature in Greenland which looks a bit like a crater. There are some studies which support its identification as a crater, but it's not confirmed as a crater. And it's close enough to the Hiawatha crater that if it is in fact a crater, then probably these two craters were formed at the same time because it's so close. The probability that they're unrelated is really quite small if they are both only a few million years old. So it looks like there could be potentially two similarly sized craters. This other one is about 30 kilometers across as well. In fact, I think it's slightly larger than the Hiawatha. So we've got two things there that are interesting, very interesting. I just wish they'd hurry up and actually date these things.
So what are the in your Lego pieces that you you're kind of putting together. What is the next Lego piece that you're missing? Is there something that you're looking forward for it to be dated? For example, the dating of the creator. Are there any other, let's say, research projects that you're looking forwards to or that you're expecting?
Oh, that's the thing, that these things, you're not really aware of what else is going on. At least I'm not. So these things happen out of the blue. Yeah, certainly dating the creators would be very interesting. I think now that I published my review paper, which suggests pretty strongly that we need to take this boundary layer into account. So I'm hoping now that other scientists take this seriously and start relating their archaeological findings to this boundary layer. Then that would help to really make headway on this question of what were the effects of this impact. Were there extinctions? Do we find that lots of the extinctions sort of come up to the layer of this boundary layer? Because now we have another way of dating the archaeological evidence, not just radiocarbon. We can relate it to relative to this boundary layer and the age of that is supposedly known because it's a single event. So I'd like to see lots more studies now use this Younger Dryas boundary in interpreting their archaeological evidence, and we can make some progress on these other questions, the megafaunal extinctions, the human cultural changes. That's what I'd like to see.
Brilliant. Well, Martin, thank you very, very much for this time and for also dedicating so much to the Leo Perez show. It means a lot to me. Tell us, where can people find out about your work, and what do you have around to offer? YouTube channel, blog, etc.?
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel where I go through a lot of the papers to do with the impact evidence. I have a whole series of YouTube videos. So for a while, I was creating videos every couple of weeks. I haven't made a video for a while now. I also have videos about the Bakutepi and the zodiacal theory and interpretation and so on. Pretty much the same or similar ideas anyway are on my blog. So that's martinsweatman.blogspot.com. There's my book, Prehistory Decoded. And I think that's it.
Will we get another book?
I hope so, yeah. I'm definitely thinking, I'm planning another book. I haven't got time to write it just yet, but it's always kind of next year. Next year I'll do it. But I've got a lot of ideas, and I kind of know what it'll be more or less about. So it'll be focusing on sort of history or evidence for the history of astronomy over the last sort of 40,000 years through the time of Göbekli Tepe up to sort of the Bronze Age, essentially, and even into the Bronze Age. And what I'm looking to do is to establish that actually, astronomy and the animal symbols and the zodiac, they have a very long history, and therefore we shouldn't be surprised to see them at Göbekli Tepe.
Brilliant. As I told you last time we had a conversation, I wish that the Younger Dryas community and the people who are paying attention to this topic can perhaps make a little push on social media to see if we can bring you to the Joe Rogan experience. Because I mean, obviously, I wish that my window would be larger, but my window is very small, and I really think that your ideas have a great space in the world. You offer a lot of serenity to a very hectic debate. I think this touches a note inside all of us because, well, it's a little bit like finding out that Santa Claus doesn't exist, right? It's something like, oh, the past, all the story that I had that was told to me, perhaps it's not correct. A, B, it also carries with it this energetic impact that, wow, perhaps our our ancestors survived this event, and that has a lot of implications for us as a species. The fact that all our ancestors, theoretically, if this is a fact, survived this. And I was talking to my students recently, and they were telling me, I cannot get up from my bed to make some music and work, and I'm like, your ancestors survived that comet impact, man. Like, I think you can get up and make some music in your beautiful laptop that runs at who knows how many terahashes per second. So anyways, I think that this idea has big consequences, and it's a really important idea, and that is why I'm going to push my social media angle, hashtag get Martin to Joe or something like that, and let's get you on there, because it would be amazing that millions of people can receive, well, further, because many people have seen already your YouTube channel. and I hope that it keeps growing, and I hope that your work can continue illuminating people's lives like it did to mine. So thank you very, very much for this, and we will see you on the next one. Everybody, good day and be good. Take care.
Thanks a lot, Leo. Great to talk to you. Thank you.
Great to talk to you as well.